If you're trying to get her back by texting more, explaining yourself, or proving how much you care, stop. Because the one thing that actually makes a woman come back isn't effort, words, or promises. It's a psychological shift most people completely misunderstand. And once you get this right, everything changes. When a woman pulls away, most men respond with urgency. They send long messages, explain themselves repeatedly, ask for reassurance, and try to fix everything at once. On the surface, this feels logical. If something is breaking, you rush to repair it. But attraction does not work like a broken machine. It works like an emotional system, and pressure is the fastest way to shut that system down. Chasing creates emotional imbalance. The more you pursue, the more you position her as the emotional authority in the dynamic. She becomes the one who decides, while you become the one seeking permission to be chosen. This shift immediately lowers perceived value, not because you are less worthy, but because attraction is deeply tied to mutual emotional autonomy. When one person collapses emotionally, the other instinctively pulls away to regain balance. Another problem with chasing is that it removes emotional safety. Emotional safety doesn't mean constant contact or reassurance. It means knowing that the other person can regulate themselves. When you bombard her with messages or demands for clarity, you communicate emotional instability. Even if she once cared deeply, her nervous system starts associating you with pressure, obligation, and emotional exhaustion rather than comfort. Chasing also robs her of the opportunity to feel her own emotions. When you constantly explain, justify, or plead, you interrupt her natural processing. She doesn't get the space to miss you, reflect, or emotionally reset. Instead, her focus shifts to managing your feelings. And when someone feels responsible for another person's emotional state, attraction quietly turns into resistance. There's also an identity shift that happens when you chase. You stop acting from self-respect and start acting from fear. Fear of loss, fear of replacement, fear of being forgotten. That fear leaks into your tone, your timing, and your words. Even if you don't say it directly, it's felt. And fear-based energy repels far more than silence ever will. Psychologically, chasing triggers avoidance behavior. The more one person pursues, the more the other seeks distance to restore control. This isn't cruelty, it's a natural response. Humans are wired to move toward what feels voluntary and away from what feels imposed. When your presence starts feeling compulsory, even love begins to suffocate. What most men don't realize is that stopping the chase isn't about playing hard to get. It's about restoring emotional polarity. When you step back calmly, you reintroduce balance. You signal that you can survive emotionally without forcing an outcome. That signal alone shifts how she perceives you, from desperate to grounded, from reactive to composed. Chasing also keeps you stuck in the past. Every message is about what went wrong, what you meant, what you could fix. But attraction lives in the present emotional experience. When you stop chasing, you stop reliving the breakup and start embodying stability. Stability is far more attractive than explanations. Silence, when paired with dignity, creates space for reflection. In that space, she is no longer reacting to your urgency. She is responding to absence. And absence, when not poisoned by bitterness or manipulation, allows emotions to surface organically. Memories return without resistance. Curiosity replaces certainty, and emotional pressure dissolves into emotional awareness. Stepping back is not weakness, it's emotional leadership. It communicates that you value yourself enough not to beg for connection, and that you understand attraction well enough to let emotions breathe rather than suffocate them. Absence is often misunderstood as indifference, but psychologically it works in the opposite direction. When a woman is constantly exposed to someone, her emotional response becomes familiar and predictable. Familiarity is comforting, but it rarely sustains desire on its own. Absence disrupts that predictability and reactivates emotional awareness, which is where attraction quietly begins to rebuild. When you remove yourself without hostility or explanation, the brain begins to fill in the gaps. Human psychology is uncomfortable with unfinished emotional loops. When contact stops suddenly yet respectfully, the mind starts revisiting shared memories, conversations, and moments of connection. This is not nostalgia by force. It is memory resurfacing naturally because there is no new stimulus to override it. Absence also restores emotional autonomy. During conflict or breakup phases, emotions are heightened and reactive. Words exchanged in this state rarely land as intended. Space allows emotional intensity to settle, which shifts perception from defensive to reflective. Without constant interaction, she no longer feels the need to justify her decision to you or to herself. That internal justification slowly weakens when it is no longer being reinforced. Another psychological effect of absence is value reassessment. When someone is always available, their presence is taken for granted. When that presence is removed calmly, the brain begins to reassess its significance. This reassessment is not conscious, it happens emotionally. She starts noticing the absence in small, unexpected moments, when something reminds her of you, when silence feels different, when routines subtly change. Absence creates contrast. Before you were part of her emotional environment. Now you are missing from it. Contrast heightens perception. It sharpens awareness of what was lost versus what currently exists. If the relationship had genuine connection, absence brings that contrast into focus more clearly than constant communication ever could. There is also a control dynamic at play. During a breakup, the person who leaves often feels a sense of emotional control. When you disappear peacefully, you remove yourself from that dynamic. Control dissolves into uncertainty, not anxiety, but curiosity. She no longer knows how you're feeling, what you're thinking, or whether you've emotionally moved on. That uncertainty draws attention inward. Absence allows emotional curiosity to replace emotional fatigue. When communication is constant after a breakup, it often becomes draining. Every interaction carries emotional weight. Silence removes that weight. And once the emotional exhaustion fades, what remains is the core emotional bond if it existed at all. Importantly, absence works only when it is clean. No passive-aggressive posts, no indirect messages, no attempts to be seen. True absence is neutral and self-contained. This neutrality signals maturity. It communicates that you respect boundaries and understand emotional pacing. Maturity is rare and rarity is psychologically attractive. Absence also gives you space to stabilize yourself. That internal shift subtly changes the energy you bring, even without contact. When you stop centering your emotional world around her reactions, you reclaim self-respect. That self-respect becomes perceptible when contact eventually resumes, even if it is minimal. Over time, absence reframes the emotional narrative. Instead of remembering the tension at the end, she begins recalling the emotional safety, laughter, and connection that existed before things fractured. Emotional memory is selective, and silence gives it room to soften sharp edges and amplify warmth. Absence does not guarantee return, but it guarantees clarity. It removes emotional noise, restores balance, and allows attraction to operate without pressure, logic, or persuasion. Regret does not come from losing someone who begged to stay. It comes from losing someone who handled the loss with dignity. When a woman leaves and expects emotional collapse, resistance, or pleading, and instead encounters calm self-respect, it creates a psychological interruption. Her expectations are challenged, and that disruption becomes the starting point of regret. Self-respect is communicated more through behavior than words. It shows in what you refuse to do: no chasing, no over-explaining, no emotional bargaining. This restraint sends a powerful message. You value yourself even in rejection. That message reshapes how she categorizes you emotionally. You are no longer just someone who wanted her. You become someone who stood firm in their worth. When self-respect is present, power dynamics shift, not in an aggressive way, but in a balanced one. You stop trying to convince her of your value, and paradoxically, that is when your value becomes visible. Humans are wired to respect those who respect themselves, especially under emotional pressure. Calm composure under loss signals inner stability. Another psychological layer is identity preservation. When you maintain self-respect, you protect the version of you she originally felt drawn to. Desperation distorts that identity. It replaces confidence with insecurity and clarity with confusion. By staying grounded, you preserve emotional continuity, allowing her to remember you as you were, not as you became in panic. Self-respect also removes guilt from her emotional process. When you beg or break down, you place emotional responsibility on her. She may feel justified in leaving, but she also feels burdened. That burden blocks reflection. When you accept the situation with maturity, you remove that weight. Without guilt clouding her emotions, she can process the loss honestly. Regret grows in emotional quiet. When there is no drama to react to, emotions settle into reflection. She begins to question her assumptions. Was the decision as necessary as it felt in the heat of the moment? Was the connection more valuable than she allowed herself to feel? These questions only surface when the environment is calm. Self-respect also signals emotional abundance. You are not behaving like someone whose life collapses without her. That doesn't mean she feels replaced. It means she feels that you are whole. Wholeness is attractive because it feels safe. It suggests that a relationship with you is a choice, not an obligation. Another overlooked aspect is boundaries. When you maintain self-respect, you implicitly reinforce boundaries. Boundaries communicate that access to you is earned, not guaranteed. This reframes her perception of the breakup. Instead of seeing you as someone waiting indefinitely, she begins to sense that returning would require intention, not convenience. Self-respect changes the emotional narrative. The story is no longer about you losing her. It becomes about two people separating with dignity. That shift makes space for reconsideration. When people feel they lost something of quality rather than escaped something chaotic, regret naturally follows. Most importantly, self-respect keeps you aligned with your own values. That alignment stabilizes your emotions and prevents reactive behavior. Stability becomes your emotional signature. Even without direct contact, that signature is felt through absence, memory, and contrast. Regret is not forced. It emerges when dignity replaces desperation and calm replaces chaos, allowing attraction and respect to coexist in the same emotional space. Emotional contrast is created when your behavior after the breakup is radically different from what she expected. Most people anticipate emotional reactions: anger, pleading, constant communication, or visible distress, when instead she encounters calm, restraint, and emotional steadiness. Her brain struggles to reconcile the difference. That gap between expectation and reality becomes psychologically engaging. Contrast sharpens perception. When emotions were high during the relationship's end, everything felt intense, reactive, and heavy. By shifting into emotional neutrality, you introduce a new emotional environment. This new version of you feels quieter, more grounded, and less demanding. The absence of emotional chaos highlights what used to feel normal, and normal suddenly feels different. This contrast works because the human brain notices changes more than constants. When you were consistently available, emotionally expressive, and responsive, she adapted to that rhythm. When that rhythm stops and is replaced by composure, the brain flags it as significant. Significance draws attention. Attention leads to reassessment. Emotional contrast also disrupts negative emotional conditioning. If the last phase of the relationship involved arguments, tension, or emotional pressure, she may have subconsciously associated you with stress. When you remove that stress without replacing it with resentment, the emotional association begins to loosen. Calm behavior rewrites emotional memory more effectively than explanations ever could. Another important element of emotional contrast is unpredictability, not in behavior, but in outcome. When you stop reacting, she no longer knows where she stands emotionally with you. This isn't manipulation, it's the natural result of emotional self-regulation. Uncertainty activates curiosity, and curiosity reopens emotional engagement. Contrast also reveals emotional depth. Anyone can react emotionally when hurt. It takes internal strength to remain centered. That strength is felt, even without communication. It changes the way she recalls interactions. Past moments of stability become more prominent, while moments of conflict lose their emotional charge. Emotional contrast removes the emotional script she prepared. Often, someone who leaves expects resistance or validation of their decision. When neither appears, the emotional script collapses. Without that script, she must write a new internal narrative. That narrative often includes questions about whether she fully understood your emotional capacity. There is also a self-reflection effect. Your calmness indirectly invites her to examine her own emotional responses. When one person is composed, the other becomes more aware of their own reactions. This awareness can lead to emotional humility, where defensiveness softens into curiosity. Contrast strengthens presence through absence. You are no longer emotionally loud. You become emotionally noticeable by being quiet. This quiet is not empty, it's grounded. It carries self-control, emotional intelligence, and maturity. Those qualities linger in memory far longer than emotional speeches. Another layer of contrast is timing. While emotions are fresh, she may feel relief or certainty. As time passes and your emotional steadiness remains consistent, that certainty weakens. Consistency in calm behavior reinforces authenticity. It shows that your composure isn't an act, it's a state. Emotional contrast also changes the perceived emotional cost of reconnecting. If she remembers you as reactive or intense, returning feels risky. When she perceives you as emotionally stable, reconnecting feels safer. Safety is often the gateway through which attraction quietly returns. This contrast does not demand attention, but it earns it. It doesn't chase emotional validation, but it creates emotional gravity. And gravity pulls without effort. After a breakup, the story people tell themselves matters more than the facts of what happened. Narratives shape emotions, and emotions guide future decisions. If the breakup narrative is framed as escape, relief, or necessity, returning feels illogical. But when the narrative shifts toward loss, complexity, or unfinished emotional business, reconsideration becomes possible. Most breakup narratives are reinforced by reaction. When you argue, defend yourself, or try to prove your worth, you confirm the story that the relationship was emotionally exhausting. Even if that was never your intention, your behavior becomes evidence supporting her decision. Silence, on the other hand, removes reinforcement and allows the narrative to loosen. Reframing does not happen through persuasion. It happens through contrast and consistency. When your post-breakup behavior does not match the negative version of you she may have constructed, cognitive dissonance appears. Her mind must reconcile two conflicting images: the stressed, problematic partner she justified leaving, and the composed, respectful individual she now observes. Time plays a critical role in narrative shift. Immediate reactions are driven by emotion, but memory reshapes events over time. When there is no new conflict to anchor the negative story, emotional memory begins to soften sharp edges. Moments of connection, support, and intimacy quietly resurface without being challenged by fresh disappointment. Another element of reframing is responsibility. When you refuse to blame, guilt, or pressure her, you remove emotional opposition. Opposition strengthens narratives. Neutrality weakens them. Without emotional resistance, the story loses its dramatic structure and becomes more open to reinterpretation. Reframing also involves changing the role you occupy in her internal story. Instead of being the person who needed her validation, you become the person who accepted reality with grace. That role is psychologically disarming. It invites respect, even in absence of attraction, and respect is often the bridge back to emotional interest. The breakup narrative also influences how she talks about you to others. When there is no drama to report, no emotional chaos to describe, the story becomes less extreme. Social reinforcement of the breakup decision weakens. Without repeated justification, doubts surface more easily. Your behavior after the breakup becomes the final chapter she reads. If that chapter is filled with desperation or bitterness, it confirms the ending. If it is calm and dignified, it leaves the story open-ended. Open endings invite revisitation. Reframing occurs subtly through emotional absence. Without constant reminders of conflict, her emotional system resets. She no longer feels the need to defend her choice. That defense, once removed, allows curiosity to return. Curiosity leads to reflection rather than resistance. Another psychological shift happens when the narrative moves from blame to mutual complexity. When you don't assign fault, the breakup feels less absolute. It becomes a moment of misalignment rather than a permanent verdict. This reframing makes reconnection feel less like reversal and more like growth. Reframing also affects how she perceives potential future interactions. If the narrative is negative, future contact feels risky. When the narrative softens, contact feels neutral or even safe. Safety lowers emotional barriers. The story she tells herself is not rewritten by words, but by consistency. Calm actions, emotional restraint, and respect for boundaries quietly reshape the meaning of what happened and what could still be possible.